You've been the strong one for so long that everyone forgot you might not be. Including you. And then one day, you weren't. And nobody knew what to do. What if being strong wasn't strength but a role you couldn't escape? What if you held it together for everyone else so long that you forgot how to fall apart? What if collapsing wasn't weakness, it was the only honest thing left? Because strength isn't sustainable when it's all you're allowed to be. And the person who holds everyone else up eventually has nothing left to stand on. Welcome to Unfiltered Adulthood, where we explore the quiet psychological shifts that reshape you in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. If this resonates, subscribe and hit like. There's someone who became the strong one without choosing it. It happened gradually. A family crisis where they stepped up. A friend's breakdown where they were the steady presence. A workplace emergency where they kept calm. And each time, people noticed. And each time, the role became more fixed. Until it wasn't a choice anymore. It was just who they were. They were the person people called in a crisis. The one who had it together. The one who never complained. The one who could handle anything. And for a long time, they wore that identity with pride. It felt good to be needed. To be reliable. To be the person others could count on when everything else was falling apart. But somewhere along the way, being strong stopped being a quality and became a requirement. People stopped asking if they were okay because they assumed the answer was always yes. They stopped offering support because the strong one doesn't need support. They stopped checking in because checking in implied weakness. And weakness wasn't something the strong one was allowed. So they kept going. Through their own struggles. Through their own pain. Through moments when they desperately needed someone to ask if they were okay. But they'd trained everyone so well to see them as unbreakable that nobody thought to ask. And asking felt impossible because it would shatter the image. And the image was all anyone seemed to know. The weight accumulated slowly. Like erosion. Each crisis they managed. Each person they supported. Each breakdown they prevented. It all added up. And they carried it quietly because that's what the strong one does. They don't complain. They don't burden others. They handle it. Always. But handling it required pushing their own needs further and further down. Every emotion that didn't fit the strong persona got suppressed. Every moment of vulnerability got hidden. Every crack got patched over with more performance. Because if they let anyone see them struggling, what would that make them? Weak? Unreliable? Not the person everyone knew. The breaking point came without warning. Or maybe there were warnings they'd ignored. Small moments where they felt themselves slipping. Where the weight felt unbearable. Where they wanted to scream or cry or just stop. But they pushed through because that's what they did. Until the day they couldn't anymore. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single catastrophic event. Just a moment where everything that had been held together with willpower and performance suddenly couldn't be held anymore. They broke. Not publicly. Not loudly. But completely. And they had no idea how to handle it because they'd never been allowed to not be strong. The worst part wasn't the breaking. It was the aftermath. Because nobody knew what to do with them when they weren't strong. Their friends didn't know how to support someone they'd only ever leaned on. Their family didn't know how to help someone who'd always been the helper. Their partner didn't know how to hold space for someone who'd always held space for everyone else. And the confusion on people's faces when they admitted they weren't okay felt like confirmation of what they'd always feared. That their value was conditional. That people needed them to be strong. That being anything other than that made them a burden. That their worth was tied to their ability to handle things. And without that ability, they were nothing. And the loneliest realization was this, that they'd been surrounded by people for years but had never actually been seen. Because the role had obscured the person. And nobody had bothered to look underneath. They tried to explain it. Tried to tell people that they were struggling. That they needed support. That being strong all the time had broken something inside them they didn't know how to fix. But the words felt foreign. Like speaking a language they'd never learned. Because they'd spent so long being the listener that they'd forgotten how to be heard. And some people tried. Really tried. But even their attempts felt awkward. Because the dynamic was so ingrained. They'd reach out for support and people would automatically defer back to them. Would start offloading their own problems. Would treat the conversation as a momentary lapse that would pass. Because the strong one always bounces back. Right? But they weren't bouncing back. They were barely functioning. And the gap between how people saw them and how they actually felt was so vast it felt unbridgeable. So they started retreating. Isolating. Because performing strength when you have none left is excruciating. And admitting weakness to people who can't handle it is worse than being alone. They started to realize that they'd never actually learned how to be vulnerable. They'd learned how to manage everyone else's vulnerability. How to hold space. How to be steady. But when it was their turn to need that from someone else, they didn't know how to ask. And when they did ask, they didn't know how to receive it. The guilt was overwhelming. They felt guilty for breaking. For not being strong enough to sustain the role. For disappointing people who needed them. For being the crisis instead of the crisis manager. And that guilt made everything worse because it meant they couldn't even collapse without judgment. Even from themselves. But slowly, through the wreckage of their collapse, something else started to emerge. A question. What if they didn't have to be strong? What if that role had never been theirs to carry? What if they'd taken it on because nobody else would, but that didn't mean it was their responsibility forever? They started looking at the role differently. Not as identity but as survival mechanism. They'd become strong because circumstances demanded it. Because someone had to be. Because the alternative was chaos. But that origin story didn't make it sustainable. It just explained how they'd gotten trapped. And trapped was the right word. Because the role had become a prison. Every time someone called them strong, it felt less like a compliment and more like a sentence. Like confirmation that they'd never be allowed to be anything else. That their complexity had been flattened into a single dimension. That they'd been turned into a function instead of a person. The turning point came when they stopped trying to convince people they weren't okay and started accepting it themselves. They gave themselves permission to not be strong. To not have it together. To not be the person everyone relied on. And that permission felt revolutionary. Because they'd been waiting for someone else to give it to them. But nobody was going to. Because everyone needed them to stay in the role. So they gave it to themselves. And it felt selfish. And terrifying. And necessary. Because the alternative was continuing to perform until there was nothing left. And they were already dangerously close to that point. They started setting boundaries. Small ones at first. Saying no to being the crisis manager. Admitting when they were struggling instead of hiding it. Asking for support instead of always providing it. And every boundary felt like betrayal. Like letting people down. Like confirming their worst fear that they were selfish. But something else started happening too. The people who truly cared adjusted. They stepped up. They learned to support instead of just lean. They started seeing the person instead of just the role. And the ones who couldn't handle it, who needed them to stay strong, started to drift. And that hurt. But it was also clarifying. Because it revealed who had loved them and who had loved what they could do for them. And that distinction, painful as it was necessary. They learned that breaking wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something more honest. That the strength they performed wasn't real strength. Real strength was admitting when you're not okay. Real strength was asking for help. Real strength was letting people see you as human instead of superhuman. The person who had been the strong one for everyone learned to be human for themselves. And it wasn't easy. The guilt lingered. The fear of disappointing people remained. The instinct to suppress and perform and manage still surfaced. But they were learning a different way. A way where their worth wasn't tied to their ability to hold it together. Where being broken sometimes was allowed. Where needing support didn't make them weak. And what they discovered was that the people who mattered didn't need them to be strong. They just needed them to be real. And being real meant sometimes falling apart. Sometimes not having answers. Sometimes being the one who needed holding instead of doing the holding. You've been the strong one for so long that everyone forgot you might not be. Including you. And then one day you weren't. And nobody knew what to do. But maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing what to do is where real connection begins. Where performance ends and presence starts. Where roles dissolve and people emerge. Because being strong all the time isn't strength. It's armor. And armor is heavy. And at some point, you have to choose between carrying the weight and being free. And freedom means letting people see that underneath the strong one is just a person. Who hurts. Who struggles. Who breaks. And who deserves support just as much as anyone else. The collapse wasn't the end. It was the moment you stopped performing and started living. And living means all of it. The strength and the weakness. The holding together and the falling apart. The being there for others and needing others to be there for you. Not one or the other. Both. Because that's what being human actually is.